Well, Luke 7:39 says, "Now when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he spoke to himself, saying, 'This man, if he were a prophet, would know who and what manner of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner.'" So we see here the classic dynamic of the difference between two kinds of sin. Really, one is a sin of commission, and even the writer Luke says she was a sinner, which is true. And then we see the attitude of the Pharisee there, Simon, and he mentions this thing about the woman being a sinner. So he calls her a sinner. We don't know exactly Simon's state, spiritual state. Jesus actually wasn't that hard on him. Jesus was actually nice to him and congenial. And, you can go read what Jesus said there in Matthew chapter 7 in response to what the Pharisee was thinking, right? So we have this dynamic of a person who lives constantly, possibly. I'm not saying that Simon was living in sin of omission because he didn't love people or whatever, but we have this dynamic at play. Whether Simon was one of those people or not, it still shows this kind of attitude of the Pharisee who, a Pharisee is simply someone who looks good outwardly and looks religious and is religious, but doesn't actually sacrifice anything for the kingdom of heaven, right? It's a person who is all about the way they look, all about the way they come across, staying clean, dressing right and saying the right things, but inside, as we see, these kind of people can be the most wicked. And we never see Jesus being harsh with prostitutes. We never even see him being harsh with tax collectors. Everybody, I suppose, knows what a tax collector is, but it's basically a person who betrays their nation. I mean, the way the Jewish people back then saw a tax collector would probably be similar to the way we would think of some person who was an American soldier or something and went and sided with terrorists, with jihad or ISIS or whatever. Maybe those things don't exist anymore as much as they did, but this idea of someone who was a good old American boy, from Kansas or something, and somehow gets twisted to where he goes and puts on a turban and starts reciting the Quran and throws on a bomb and blows up a building here in his own country. Right? We wouldn't think very highly of a person like that, right? And that's the way the Jews would have seen tax collectors. Probably worse, right? Because you and I might hear about somebody like that on the news, or something like that, and we'd think, how disgusting, what a despicable loser, and rightly so, right? He's despicable. Yeah, betraying your country is not good, I suppose, necessarily. Depends on what your country is and what they represent. But strapping on a bomb and killing a bunch of innocent people you got to be a really sick person to do that. The Jews, on the other hand, when they would encounter a tax collector, that was a guy in your neighborhood that you'd grown up with, that at some point in time, likely because of financial hardship or maybe the what he could gain from having this job, turned on his own people and would be like, hey, you there, Peter, you owe da-da-da amount of money, come and pay it. And the reason why the Romans hired tax collectors, they likely did this in every single place that they conquered, they would hire locals that knew the other people. They knew how much they made, right? They would use the grapevine, the gossip system, and they knew, and likely they were kind of like spies almost, and they would go around and ask questions, and so they knew who the people were that lived around them, and they could report somebody for not paying their taxes, and they would get a cut of that. And that's pretty disgusting, right? You can see how people felt the way they did. Why didn't Jesus ever have harsh things to say towards those kind of people? I mean, Matthew, who wrote the first book of the New Testament, and probably my favorite book in the whole Bible, maybe, was a tax collector. Was a really, really bad person, actually, in his past life. Why were Jesus' words so harsh towards religious leaders who would carry a fake semblance of religion and holiness while inwardly being just as evil as a tax collector? The tax collector lived and made his money by, I guess you could call it a sin of commission, right? Betraying your own people on behalf of the Roman government, that's pretty bad. That's pretty serious. I don't know if there's actually somewhere in the Old Testament that specifically categorizes that as a specific sin, but It actually was a sin. I mean, even if somebody was in some other culture, some Egyptian that the Romans may have hired to do the same exact thing, likely that existed everywhere the Romans went. They didn't have technology to enforce all that kind of stuff like they do now. So that is I don't care who you are, that would be a sin. Okay. And it's a sin of commission. But Jesus wasn't hard. He didn't rail on those people. He didn't rail on prostitutes. And I'm just using those two kinds of people because those are the type of people that the Pharisees would mention. Oh, Jesus is hanging out with these kinds of people, right? Prostitutes and tax collectors. It uses those words repeatedly throughout the Gospels. But Jesus was very harsh on the Pharisees. So let's take tax collecting and prostitution as people who are living and making money off of a sin of commission, right? They have to sin. They have to do something wrong that's a sin, or they have to do something that hurts and betrays other people somehow in order to make their living. Likely most of these people were put in that situation because of literally maybe not having food to eat, right? Somebody has a good brain and they know math and they can read and write, but they don't have any food to eat. You might make a good tax collector, right? A woman's beautiful and has a good body, but doesn't have any money and she's not eating. It might make a good prostitute. Unfortunately, that's just the way it is. So these people, again, were in a situation of hardship and all of that, where they likely were just pushed by that into making their living by committing sin constantly. And Jesus was not hard on them. He was very hard on Pharisees. Now, who were the Pharisees? You could say that they were people that were in the same situation, right? They were being oppressed by Rome, but they were using their religion as a cover. They were committing sins of omission. Now, how does being a Pharisee and using your religion to look good in front of people, how does that the same thing as committing sins of omission? So I'll explain to you. To be a Pharisee, all you have to do is commit sins of omission. Be perfect on the outside. Be as religious as you can. Stay clean, right? Don't drink, don't smoke, that sort of stuff. Dress nice. But omit what Jesus said. What did Jesus say to them? You've omitted the weightier matters of the law. They were just as grappling and evil and money hungry as the tax collectors. The tax collectors were grappling and evil and money hungry, I guess you could say. The Pharisees were exactly the same way. They were grappling and evil and didn't care about orphans and widows and didn't care who was eating or who was not. And they would literally just come and take, whatever, that thing about Jesus telling them, you tell people you don't have to support your parents. You just give the money to the temple as part of your tithe, that's pretty sick. So these people are just as evil as the tax collectors, and they're doing the exact same thing. They're betraying their people. They're evil, but they have a religious cover over it. And they're saying, I'm your leader. You should listen to me. I'm holy. Look how well I keep the Torah. And they would actually keep the Torah and do all these things very strictly. But they were just as grappling and evil as the tax collectors. The tax collectors, it was out in the open. I'm sure that these people likely experienced open hatred and ridicule and dirty looks and people spitting on them or whatever everywhere they went. They must have been extremely hated by everyone. The problem with the Pharisees and those Sadducees or whoever, the religious leaders, is that they were just as evil, but they covered it over and people respected them. And they were living a lie. They were living a complete lie. So how is being a Pharisee the same as living by committing sins of omission? It's because you're doing everything else right outwardly, and it's just for looks, and likely because of whatever financial gain and prestige and honor from other people that it gives you. But all you have to do, again, to be a Pharisee is to omit caring about people, to omit loving people, to omit making any sacrifices on behalf of other people, to omit caring about other people's suffering. That's it. So you can do everything else outwardly to look good, but you're omitting, like Jesus said, the weightier matters of the law. And what are those? You care about people who are suffering, and again, if you can't care about people's earthly physical life, how can you claim to care about their spiritual life? So again, uh, the way I grew up and the way many of us grew up was that our form of religion, our form of spirituality, and all of that, the way we saw sin was almost entirely geared towards sins of commission. We never saw sin in the sense of that a person can sin because of what they don't do, you know. Uh, and so Jesus was far more harsh on the people who committed sin of omission than he was on the people who committed sins of commission. A sin of omission is far more profound. It's something more constant because it's something you don't do, right? It's like, uh, what's worse? You have two kids fighting. I have a daughter that's 9 and a son that's 7, and my daughter that's 9 is still a little bit bigger and stronger, and she's a little smarter than my son who's 7, and she bullies him. And I sit here on the couch and watching YouTube or playing video games or something, and I don't do anything about it. I see what's going on, and I see that my daughter's bullying my son, and he starts crying, "Daddy," like that, right? And he's complaining about what she's doing, and she keeps doing it, whatever she's doing to him. And they're both looking at me, and she's looking at me to see if I'll do anything, and I don't do anything about it. And then, she actually hurts him somehow, and then he's got to go crying to mommy because daddy didn't do anything because he's too lazy. Who committed the worst sin? My daughter's committing a sin of commission. She's actually doing something, to him. I'm committing a sin of omission by laziness. And I know better. Okay, I'm the one that knows better. She's in some way being a kid. She knows better, but she's still just being a kid. But she doesn't know better the way I know better, right? She doesn't know what I know. She doesn't have the responsibility I have. I could put a stop to it. I could discipline her somehow to make her stop doing it, but I don't. So I don't know if that's a very good example or not, but who has the worst sin? So in this situation, the Pharisees like the one sitting on the couch, like, I don't care about you, Well, you have people out there that don't know what you know, and they don't have the responsibility you have, right, as a spiritual leader, committing these little foolish, immature sins of commission. Who has more sin? We'll see what Jesus says about it. We would generally think of the Romans, back then in that time as pretty bad sinners, right? They didn't have what the Jews had spiritually, obviously. They were idolaters, they were crass fornicators and homosexuals who just completely lived in sin, and they were completely disgusting to the Jews as far as their lifestyle, right? They were completely pagan in every sense of the word and godless. Not all of them, obviously, but generally that was their culture. They didn't know any better. Well, read what Jesus says here in John 19:11 when they were handing him over to Pilate. Pilate's talking to him. Jesus says, "You would have no power over me unless it were given to you from above. So the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin." Now, this isn't necessarily the same situation of Jesus comparing Pharisees to prostitutes, but I want to use this passage because it's powerful, because Jesus is standing in front of the person who literally has the authority to decide whether he lives and dies. And we'll find out later in history, after the church got started, that the Romans became exceedingly horrible and wicked. And the Roman emperors are some of the most disgusting people who have ever lived in every possible way. And they already were like that. But they went even farther and started mass murdering and torturing Christians for no reason. So it's amazing to me that Jesus would talk like this. He's talking to a person who knows a lot. I mean, Pilate wasn't some dummy, he's a highly educated person. But for some reason, Jesus put the Pharisees, the priests, those people in a spiritual authority in his culture of the Judeo, culture, as having more authority and more responsibility and a bigger sin in some way than Pilate did. Obviously, Pilate, as far as we can tell, would have never had, he says it obviously. Pilate didn't want to put Jesus to death because he was a logical thinker. He wasn't stupid. He didn't really, he did get the Pharisees and the priests' reason for wanting to get rid of Jesus. They totally understood that. But he wasn't responsible in the same way. He wasn't a Jew. He wasn't a priest. He wasn't a Pharisee. He was just a guy that had rose into the ranks of the military, all his life, or was born to a family of means and became a governor of some sort, right? And this problem here with Jesus just fell in his lap. And it's amazing to me. He actually says, "You would have no power over me at all unless it were given to you from above." Okay, well, who's he talking about? It seems like the priests and the scribes and the Pharisees were below Pilate. Jesus says that they were above him. And we know that he's talking about them, the religious leaders, because he says, "So the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin." So forget about prostitutes and tax collectors. He's talking to the Roman governor, who's an extremely wicked person, as wicked as you can get. So it's amazing to me, that Jesus would actually say that to a Roman governor. Forget prostitutes and tax collectors who are literally just trying to get by. They're literally just trying to get by. This guy was not just trying to get by, right? He was a high up in the Roman government. In the Roman government, all they did was rob, steal, and kill and rape. That's all they did. He was one of them. So it's amazing to me that Jesus would actually put the religious leaders of his own people as being more evil than Pilate. And maybe it was partially because these people, as it's actually coming out more and more in modern times, that a lot of the rabbinical Jewish tradition stretching way back actually knows that Jesus was the Messiah. They still won't admit it for whatever the reasons are. There's a lot of information coming out that says that a lot of these people, way back then and now, had to have known and did know and admitted it, or basically admitted it, or almost admitted it. But a lot of these people literally lived and died without admitting. I'm talking about people from back in this time. And so somehow that gives them a certain kind of responsibility because they understand the whole thing, right? Pilate couldn't have possibly understood the whole thing, the Judeo-Christian tradition and the eschatology and all of these things like the Jews understood, especially the religious leaders. So he didn't have the same responsibility. He didn't grow up in it. He didn't bear that burden. Luke 11:37. It says, "And as he spoke, a certain Pharisee asked him to dine with him, so he went in and sat down to eat." So these situations seem to kind of come up when Jesus is eating at a Pharisee's house. He wasn't very nice to this guy like he was to Simon earlier in chapter 7 involving the repentant prostitute, right? This time he wasn't as nice. Verse 38, "When the Pharisee saw it, he marveled that he, Jesus, had not first washed before dinner," because they had a religious tradition about washing your hands. It's good to wash your hands, obviously, but they made some religious rule out of it. It's like people nowadays who say you drink a beer, you're going to hell. Oh, where's that in the Bible? Drinking wine is part of the communion. That's one of the most basic things in the whole gospel. In what Jesus did, is part of it is drinking wine during the communion. As often as you do this in remembrance to me. Well, this is the same kind of thing. They make up this insane rule that doesn't even make any sense, right? It's good to stay clean, but how does that damn your soul, right? And so verse 39, "Then the Lord said to him, 'Now you Pharisees make the outside of the cup and dish clean, but your inward part is full of greed and wickedness. Foolish ones, did not he who make the outside make the inside also?'" So Jesus is right now clearly, he's attacking this guy. It's just a fact, he is. And imagine that. You're supposed to be polite when you come over to somebody else's house to eat. Imagine back then, they were really into being polite, having good manners. But Jesus wasn't playing that game, right? So what Jesus is saying is, you look good on the outside, but you're not right. You're a total hypocrite, is what he's telling this guy. I mean, he's saying you and all of the people like you, more or less, or most of the people like you. "But rather gives alms of such things as you have, then indeed all things are clean to you." Wow. "But woe to you, Pharisees, for you tithe mint and rue and all manner of herbs and pass by justice and the love of God. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. Woe to you, Pharisees, for you love the best seats in the synagogues and greeting in the marketplaces." And, it goes on and on. It gets even worse. So Jesus is being real hard on this guy, not like he was with the other guy. And this Pharisee triggered this reaction in Jesus simply by apparently thinking Jesus didn't wash his hands. It doesn't even say that he said it. Like the other guy, he was thinking, and then Jesus responded to what he was thinking, not anything he said. Apparently, here it appears to be the same way. The Pharisee thought something, and he thought, why didn't Jesus wash his hands? And so then Jesus goes on this tirade. And so, there's another place, I don't believe it's here, but it basically says that he calls the Pharisees children of Satan. And so who has the worst sin, right? The people who are outdoing sins of commission, many times based on their financial problems they have, maybe not even eating, and that forces them to go do something, or the religious leader who does what Jesus is describing. I mean, it goes on. It says the blood of all the prophets, from Abel to somebody named Zechariah. I'm not sure if that's the Zechariah that wrote the book of Zechariah. I'm assuming it is. Will be required of this generation. So he's laying into him. And it says, and as he said these things to them, the scribes and Pharisees began to assail him vehemently. And so it goes on. The dinner that Jesus came to did not end well. It was not a nice, polite, normal dinner. It looks like in Luke 7, that did end up being a nice dinner, a nice, pleasant, polite, fun occasion, right? This did not. This did not end well. So this Pharisee had a bunch of, it says, other scribes and Pharisees over. It must have been there eating too, or hanging around or whatever. Likely he invited Jesus over with all his other Pharisee and scribe and friends. And this just went totally kaput. This dinner turned into a big old nightmare. It reminds me of a lot of the meetings we used to have when I was a little kid. You invite some people over to sing some songs and talk about Jesus, and it turns into I don't know, like this, because people can't get along. In this case, only one person in this room was right. When I was growing up, I don't know who was right and who was wrong. I guess we were all probably mostly wrong. But then in the last verse 54, they're lying in wait for him, seeking to catch him in something he might say that they might accuse him. So these people didn't care that Jesus was loving everyone around him and literally giving his entire life day after day after day, sacrificing everything on behalf of his people. They didn't care about that. They didn't love the other people. And that when Jesus said that phrase about give tithes of all that you have and everything will be clean to you, he's basically saying, he's accusing them of habitually living in sin, the sin of omission, where they just don't care and don't love and don't try to help anyone. They give their money to the temple, to the priests in the temple. So these people, likely the reason they would pay tithes to the temple would be to try to curry favor, with the temple system, because a Pharisee is not a priest. They're not part of the temple system. Neither is a scribe, but they are religious leaders, right? Scribes basically responsible for writing down the scriptures and keeping them copied and passed down from generation to generation. Right there, Jesus puts this Pharisaical lifestyle of omitting care for people who actually need help as being a far worse sin than the people who are out committing sins like prostitution or tax collecting. What's a worse father? Let's say a father who drinks and smokes in front of his kids, but he actually loves them and he's nice to him and he's there for him, or a father who's not there at all. So you could accuse some dad that drinks or smokes in front of his kids and be like, you shouldn't drink or smoke in front of your kids. It's not a good example. Do you want them to grow up drinking and smoking? And he might say, no, not really, but I'm sorry, I need to quit smoking and drinking so much. But a father, a biological progenitor, somebody who got some woman pregnant a couple times and then literally just disappeared. We all know people like that. Which is worse? And so that's kind of the way Jesus looked at these religious leaders. The church nowadays, and maybe even more so, when I was younger, always really was focused on sins of commission, things that people are doing, and paid no attention at all to the omissions people made and the lack of love and the lack of caring and the lack of interest in other people's souls or in their spiritual state, and so Jesus thought of that as a far larger sin, and Jesus' parables are far more geared towards aiming at sin of omission. Jesus' parables are all about performance versus lack of performance almost entirely, which is amazing because that's the main sacred cow doctrine of modern evangelicalism, modern Christianity, is this idea of God doesn't want your performance. He's not interested in your performance. Every evangelical Christian will tell you that. They may have a different way of wording it, or think of it in some different way than another evangelical Christian, but that's more or less the overarching main doctrine of our era is God is not interested in your performance. And Jesus' parables all say otherwise. So here in Matthew 5, Jesus does talk about sins of commission, and he actually goes a lot deeper than the actual committing of a sin of commission. He talks about the fact that you want to do it or wish you could commit a sin of commission, even though you don't do it, that sin's still in your heart. Okay, Matthew 5, verse 28. You've heard, don't commit adultery, but I say unto you, he who looks at a woman to lust after her has committed adultery. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. So that's pretty hardcore. That doesn't sound like a Jesus who is not interested in your performance. He's saying if you can't stop looking at women and you actually took your eyes out so you couldn't see anymore, then that would actually save your soul. That's pretty harsh, right? That's pretty scary. So then it goes on in this sort of thing. And what Jesus is saying here is not if you thought about it, you may as well done it. He's talking about something that stays inside of you that you don't get rid of, a desire that's sinful. It's not just about adultery, it's about anything, right? You still have this desire that you want to do, and maybe there's some reason outwardly why you don't do it, but you always fight the temptation and you keep wanting to do it. You should overcome the temptation eventually to where you don't even have the temptation. That would be the goal of the Christian life. You don't have to keep suffering from being tempted to do something that is wrong. Okay, there's still something in you that wishes you could do it. That's what Jesus is saying. He's not necessarily even saying if you look at a woman and you have a bad thought about her that you sinned. That may be true, but that's not even what he's saying. He's just making the point that the desire to sin should be gotten rid of. It should be fought against, and you should not have that. You should be free from desires and temptations that pull you around and make your life miserable. That's what he's saying. And so, yes, Jesus does talk about sins of commission, and he literally talks about going to hell because of those sins. If you don't do something about it, if you don't fix that problem inside of yourself, you could end up doing it, right? So, and even if you don't do it, maybe those thoughts are going to ruin your life, and maybe living with thoughts like that constantly could send you to hell. But I don't believe that's specifically what Jesus is saying. He is just making the point that the same point as the law being written on tablets of the heart, right? This is something that should be inside of you, and your very desires should change. So you shouldn't even desire anything that's sinful anymore. That's what Jesus is saying. So the point here is that although Jesus does talk about these sins of commission, he talks a lot more about sin of omission, because that's what all of the parables are about. Lack of performance is a sin of omission. Not putting any effort into your Christian walk is a sin of omission. Like Jesus said there in Luke chapter 11,